Robert E. Lee, forever a part of Civil War Journal.
Sometimes I feel like a mother's child. Sometimes I feel like a mother's child.
If a single word describes the model Christian soldier, it is duty. In the Civil War, duty came to bear heavily upon many soldiers fighting for the North and the South. But throughout the long, terrible conflict, no single man was called to greater duty nor suffered more the tug of all human struggles than Robert E. Lee.
South Carolina secedes.
Mississippi,
Florida,
Alabama,
Georgia, Louisiana,
Texas secedes.
Arlington was never more beautiful than it was that spring when my husband was summoned to Washington.
Virginia secedes.
Lee, you have made the greatest mistake of your life. Winfield Scott.
If I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home. George McClellan.
If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it.
Let us pass over the river and rest under the shade of the trees.
Yesterday, we rode on the pinnacle of success. Today, absolute ruin seems to be our portion.
Lee's army is really whipped. I feel that our success is already assured.
There's nothing left for me to do than go see General Grant. And I would rather die 1,000 deaths. Robert E. Lee, April 9th, 1865.
On the afternoon of April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee waited half an hour for Union General U.S. Grant in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house in Appomattox, Virginia. As commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's achievements were unequal in the war. But that afternoon, as he waited for Grant, Lee contemplated the hour of surrender.
He may have flashed back to scenes with the men of the Army in Northern Virginia who lay in the fields around Appomattox, hungry and tired, exhausted. He may have thought about their triumphs, or he may have replayed some of the moments where things might have gone differently and taken him to some other place than Appomattox in the spring of 1865.
A great many things were going through his mind, but fighting for the surface had to be the fact that all three of his sons had been reported missing.
Perhaps he looked back as well upon all that had transpired in the 4 years before and asked himself how he wound up there.
I think above all, he must have felt a tremendous sadness. Lee was a man who felt the tragedy of war. He also wanted to spare useless bloodshed. He was a man who could have and would have taken advantage of any military option that came his way, but there were no more options.
What General Lee's feelings were, I do not know. As he was a man of much dignity, with an impassible face, it was impossible to say whether he felt inwardly glad that the end had finally come, or felt sad over the result and was too manly to show it. Ulysses S. Grant, 1885.
For Robert E. Lee, the road to Appomattox clearly began in Arlington, Virginia on the night of April 19, 1861, when he resigned from the United States Army. But that decision, like every decision in his storied life, was deeply rooted in the history of his family and his nation.
I know of no country that can produce a family all distinguished as clever men as our Lees. George Washington, 1777.
He was born into Virginia aristocracy, a combination of two of Virginia's most venerated families, the Lees and the Carters. Two of his uncles had signed the Declaration of Independence. His father was one of George Washington's most dependable compatriots.
His father was Light Horse Harry Lee, a hero of the American Revolution. His mother was Anne Hill Carter, from a long line of people who had felt responsible for serving their communities.
Both of his parents, for very different reasons, were strong influences on his later development. His father was audacious on the battlefield, willing to take risks, which Lee certainly was as a soldier, but his father also defined things that Lee knew he didn't want to be. His father had not been able to exercise self-control and take care of his family. He'd abandoned his family. And that, I think, was a stark lesson for young Robert E. Lee.
It was his mother who raised him to love God, to serve his country. And the word duty became a preeminent guidepost for Lee all of his life. And this was really due to the training of Anne Hill Carter and the Carter clan.
Robert Edward Lee was born in the cold winter of 1807 on January 19th at Stratford Hall, his family's ancestral home along the Potomac River. Here he grew through infancy. In 1810, financial ruin sent his luckless father to debtor's prison, and the family was forced to leave Stratford. When it came time to go, young Bobby Lee, all of 3 years old, showed his first true measure of devotion.
When they got the carriage ready to roll up in the fall of 1810, he ran back to the nursery. This wonderful iron fire back in the back of the room of the nursery has two little angels at the top. And they say that he kissed the angels on the fire back goodbye. The angels are still there. Whether the story is accurate or not, we really don't know. But Lee's love for Stratford was rooted in his early years. And this was a love for this place that would never die.
Throughout his childhood, Lee was a model son, caring for his invalid mother in the absence of his disgraced father. She impressed him with the Christian tenets of duty, honor, and country. In 1825, these teachings culminated in his appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point.
Lee attended the military academy at a time when a number of other future leaders on both sides of the Civil War were present. While he got along well with all of them, he never joined them in their evening revels when they would go off the post down to Benny Haven's Tavern to have a snootful. Lee stayed behind. He wasn't one of the boys.
He's a very studious young man. There's this sense, I think, of this trying to retrieve the family name, and that compels him. And his record at West Point is exemplary.
He acquired a record at West Point, which has never been equal, never will, I don't think. He never accumulated a demerit in 4 years at the academy, which is almost impossible to conceive that he did not get a mark for some small, inconsequential infraction of the rules. He never did.
In 1829, Lee graduated second in his class, and given the choice of assignments, he joined the elite Army Corps of Engineers. As he began his military career, Lieutenant Lee also courted the girl who would be his wife.
When his family moved up from Stratford Hall on the Potomac to Alexandria when he was 3 years old, among the first families to be visited by Henry Lee's family was George Washington Parke Custis and his wife and their little girl. Lee probably knew Mary Custis from the time she was 3. And they planted trees on the front lawn in front of Arlington when she was 10 and he was 12 as a sign of their affection.
Mary Anna Custis was the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. Her parents were fond of their daughter, Suiter, but Mr. Custis was reluctant to give his daughter's hand to a soldier.
It wasn't any disapproval of Robert that made him slow to approve the match. It was the fact that this young man would pursue a military career.
Mr. Custis finally blessed the union, and on June 30th, 1831, the couple married at Arlington, surrounded by the relics of the nation's first president.
Robert's 24 years old when he marries Mary, 22, and I don't think he was concerned about his connection with the revolutionary past. I think he was concerned about the girl whose hand he held and whether it quivered within his own. The idea of the American Revolution was pretty distant on June 30th, 1831. But as he became a member of the Custis family, it evolved upon him with the responsibility for defending Washington's character.
Any Virginian seeking a military career had to face living up to the example of Washington, which called for a very, very high sense of duty indeed.
Over the next 30 years, Lee would be a devoted husband, father 7 children, and distinguish himself as a dutiful servant of his country.
Robert E. Lee is the greatest soldier now living, and if he ever gets the opportunity, he will prove himself the great captain of history. General Winfield Scott, 1847.
For 30 years, Robert and Mary Lee made their permanent home at Arlington, but his duty as a soldier always took him away.
Lee served in a variety of tasks as an Army engineer. His best-known engineering duties were probably in the construction of a number of coastal fortifications, which were underway at that time.
Among many assignments, young Lieutenant Lee went to St. Louis and performed a miracle. There, in 1837, the Mississippi River threatened to wander away from the levee. Lee fought the river and a mountain of bureaucracy to keep the city from becoming a ghost town.
There was one very valuable aspect to that service as an engineer, and that was that Lee developed an eye for and a sense of the ground, of terrain, of topography, the lay of the land. Whatever you choose to call it, it's an important, crucial ingredient to any commander in war.
By the time of the Mexican War in 1846, Lee was a captain and faced battle for the first time in his life.
The war with Mexico is clearly a defining moment because he's in close proximity to Winfield Scott, who is the great American soldier of his age. Lee got to see Winfield Scott in action in Mexico, and he learned a great deal there.
Lee performed so magnificently in the Mexican War that Winfield Scott went so far as to say that it was Lee's valor and skill that brought American success in that war.
After Mexico, Lee was made lieutenant colonel, and in 1852, he became superintendent of West Point.
At West Point, Lee began to really gain those traits of character that enabled him to lead, to inspire, to criticize or reprimand without displaying anger, rage, selfishness.
He superintended any number of young men who would become important to him as subordinates and significant foes. He became familiar at the formative stages of their lives with the whole panoply of people who would fight for and against him.
A couple cadets become part and parcel of his army. One very importantly was James Earl Brown, Jeb Stuart. Lee will get to know this young, lively Jeb Stuart. Another one was this lanky, tall, sad-faced, long-faced John Bell Hood. A man I think he probably wouldn't have surmised would have been a relentless enemy was this little Irishman by the name of Philip Sheridan.
He was forever giving good advice to these young men. He would have weekly gatherings at his home where Mrs. Lee and his daughters would host a little reception.
We arrange for cadet suppers every Saturday evening. They, to be sure, need not be very exquisite, but must be just right for Papa's scrutinizing eye. Agnes Lee, November 8, 1853.
His duty at West Point was perhaps his happiest, because there he could live with his wife and family. Born between 1832 and 1846, his children, 3 boys and 4 girls, were brought up with the strong Christian values of their parents, largely influenced by the example of their father.
His sons, I think he molded into military officers. He was proud of the fact that they chose the military.
His sons probably were constantly reminded that they were Robert E. Lee's sons, and that Robert E. Lee's sons would be expected to do this or to do that. It was an impossible standard to meet, and I think it was probably a very heavy burden for his sons. He had a very loving relationship, I think, with all of his children, with his daughters and with his sons. But their lives were not really normal lives in many ways.
It must have been a very dangerous and awesome thing to go courting one of Robert E. Lee's daughters, to go knocking on the door of the superintendent's house and wanting to take out one of the daughters of this awe-inspiring figure. I think they spent much of their lives in devotion to their father.
I have met a great many cadets, but it frightens me so. I am so dreadfully diffident. Agnes Lee, November 8, 1853.
Agnes Lee, the most beautiful of all of General Lee's girls, fell in love with a cousin who drank, and so she turned him down. Agnes Lee never married.
There are those who insist that Lee loved his daughters so much that he did not want to see them marry. Whether or not Lee dominated his 4 girls into becoming spinsters is argumentative at the least. I think one or more of the daughters may well have thought that they could never find anyone who measured in image to their father.
Before the war, long before Lee was anything but a United States Army officer at a very low grade and low salary. Cousin was watching him as he sat quietly in the parlor at Arlington reading, and she said, "If I ever saw a great man, that certainly looks to me like a great man." Colonel Lee's children love him, his wife loves him, his dog loves him. There is no one who comes in contact with him who does not love him.
At 54 years old, Robert E. Lee could look back on a long, dutiful career. In 30 years, he had proved himself a capable engineer, a clever administrator, a brave soldier, a respected leader of young men, and a devoted husband and father.
He had done everything and done it well. Staff work, field command. He had actually led the contingent of Marines that put down John Brown's raid. There was nothing Lee hadn't done, and everything he had undertaken, he had performed superbly.
In 1861, people looked to Lee for what was right, and many of them sought his opinion on matters imperiling the nation. He was opposed to slavery, strongly pro-Union, and against any civil war. But above all, he remained loyal to Virginia.
It wasn't the great political interpretation of how Virginia looked at the Union. It was that Virginia really was his country, and he would go with Virginia wherever she went.
There was this sureness about Virginia and its place in American history. And when one of its sons was asked by this most dominant of all states in our early history, he answered that call.
On the night of April 19th, after Virginia quit the Union, Robert E. Lee faced the most difficult question of his life.
It was a momentous decision, a decision that kept him up all one night, pacing the floors of the Arlington mansion, weighing one against the other, wrestling with his conscience, trying to find the right decision morally, ethically, politically to make.
That night, Mary Custis Lee, the daughter, said that Arlington was like a place where a death had occurred. And the death they waited for was the end of a brilliant military career.
My husband has wept tears of blood over this terrible war. But as a man of honor and a Virginian, he must follow the destiny of his state. It was the severest struggle of his life to resign a commission he had held for 30 years. Mary Lee, April 20th, 1861.
With all my devotion to the Union and the feeling of loyalty and duty of an American citizen, I have not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home. I have therefore resigned my commission in the Army and save in defense of my native state, with the sincere hope that my poor services may never be needed. I hope I may never be called on to draw my sword. Robert E. Lee, April 20th, 1861.
On Monday, April 22nd, 1861, Robert E. Lee left his home at Arlington, never to return. Within 2 weeks, Union troops occupied his house. Mary and the girls were vagabonds of war. His boys were soldiers in gray, and Lee was in Richmond planning the defense of Virginia. While politicians boasted of a quick war, Lee thought differently.
They do not know what they say. If it comes to a conflict of arms, the war will last at least 4 years. Northern politicians do not appreciate the determination and pluck of the South. And Southern politicians do not appreciate the numbers, resources, and patient perseverance of the North. Both sides forget that we are all Americans. I foresee that a country will have to pass through a terrible ordeal, a necessary expiation perhaps for our national sins. Robert E. Lee, May 5th, 1861.
Within 6 months, Lee was a general in the Confederate Army and began to grow his whiskers. Though he held no field command, his beard quickly turned gray.
For the first year of the war, Lee served as a combination troubleshooter and military advisor for the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. As a troubleshooter, Davis sent him on these thankless tasks, few of which Lee succeeded admirably in achieving. And as a result of this, he got a variety of nicknames, none of them complimentary.
They called him Granny Lee, Evacuating Lee, and King of Spades because of his penchants for earthworks and fortifications. But Lee knew this work was vital to any defense of Richmond, the new Confederate capital.
As commander of Virginia State Forces, he wrought a miracle, which is overlooked in his career. Lee was crucial in starting the development of supplies, armament, and things like that would sustain those armies in these advanced areas. Lee starts to set the military boundaries for Virginia.
It was up to Lee to put together an army. And although so much credit is given to Generals Beauregard and Johnston for winning the Battle of First Manassas, I think much credit is owed to Lee, because after all, it was he who put the army there.
Still, it was not until June 1862 that Lee was called to lead an army.
On the night of the first day's battle at Seven Pines or Fair Oaks, as Joseph Johnston is riding through the woods, endeavoring to see what is occurring in this late fighting, he is wounded in an exchange of gunfire.
Johnston was everything that Lee was not. He wouldn't communicate with his commander. He politicked behind his back. He never did anything if he could retreat instead. Davis was thoroughly sick of Johnston by May 1862. The most propitious Yankee bullet of the entire war, so far as the Confederates were concerned, is the one that took Johnston out of the war for a while, because it gave Lee a chance to show who and what he was.
The shot that struck me down is the very best that has been fired for the Southern cause yet, for I possess in no degree the confidence of our government. And now they have in my place one who does possess it. General Joseph E. Johnston, June 1862.
When Lee took command of the Army in Northern Virginia in June of '62, one of Jefferson Davis's aides told a friend and officer in Lee's army that he will find out in time that Lee is audacity personified, and Lee would be.
It was something he had been waiting for, this opportunity to take command. And he found in the Army of Northern Virginia the great military machine by which he could demonstrate all of the brilliance that had been building up in Lee and was now ready to exude itself in the field.
The situation in June of 1862 was dire in the extreme for the Confederacy. The mammoth Army of the Potomac was within a few miles of Richmond when Lee took over.
The Federals who were besieging Richmond under George B. McClellan could literally see the spires of Richmond, could hear the bells in the church towers chiming the hours. They were that close.
What Lee accomplishes is remarkable. He reorients the war in a matter of just a few weeks from the outskirts of Richmond all the way back to the Potomac River, with his victory in the 7 Days and then his follow-up victory in the campaign of Second Manassas.
3 months later, on September 1, Lee had beaten the Union Army that was about to take Richmond. He had beaten another army that had come into Virginia. He had cleared the state of all major Union threats. And in 90 days, he was about to launch an invasion of the North. It's one of the greatest turnabouts in military history.
For more than any other reason, Lee won because of his audacity. He had very skilled subordinates in Longstreet and in Stonewall Jackson. Lee did not interfere at the tactical level with those people. He put people in the position where, in Jackson's case, they could launch a mighty attack and smash an enemy. And in Longstreet's case, they could fight with unparalleled tenacity on the defensive. It worked wonderfully well.
Under Lee's leadership, the Army of Northern Virginia was one of the great field commands in American history. Lee infused his army with an expectation of victory. He did it by providing victories on many battlefields.
Between June 1862 and March 1864, Abraham Lincoln searched for a general who could beat Robert E. Lee. Time after time, Lincoln sent new generals to the field, and time after time, Lee defeated them. He beat McClellan on the peninsula, John Pope at Second Manassas, McClellan again in the bloody stalemate of Antietam, Ambrose Burnside at Fredericksburg, Joseph Hooker at Chancellorsville. But these victories did not come without a great human cost.
The scale of the slaughter during the Civil War bothered Lee. There's no question about that. It would bother anyone with normal feelings, but that was part of being involved in a great war.
He genuinely believed he was doing God's will. He believed God was watching out for him and for his cause, and that, of course, was a grounding on which highs and lows could be evened out readily.
By the spring of 1863, Lee's army was operating at its peak. But at this moment of impending triumph, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia would suffer an unrecoverable loss: the death of General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Confederate hopes were buoyant in the spring of 1863. The Army of Northern Virginia had bloodied Union forces at Fredericksburg in December and whipped them again at Chancellorsville in May. Southerners were hailing Lee's army as the greatest ever to take the battlefield.
A great deal of Lee's success simply comes from the fact that the man was a brilliant battlefield commander. There's no greater classic example of Lee's battle tactics than the Battle of Chancellorsville, where he's outnumbered more than 2 to 1 and still divides his army in half in face of the enemy.
It was a battle that seemingly on paper Robert E. Lee could not possibly win. He won it in spectacular fashion, and his biographer Douglas Freeman calls it Lee's greatest victory.
At the moment of Lee's greatest victory, Stonewall Jackson was mortally wounded, shot accidentally by his own men in the evening of May 2nd, 1863, and will die of pneumonia 8 days later on May 10th.
Lee's immediate reaction was that it was God's will, and he said that God will raise someone else up to take Jackson's place. And God never did raise someone else up to take Jackson's place, so Lee just did the best that he could.
Lee knew he had lost his most dashing lieutenant. Lee himself had made the comment that Jackson was his right arm, that Jackson was irreplaceable. Lee did not realize just how irreplaceable Jackson was until subsequent campaigns. Lee would get to Gettysburg, for example, and Lee continued to fight his army as if Jackson were there. Lee had come to the belief that his army was invincible, that his soldiers were so capable, so self-sacrificing, so gallant in battle, that they simply couldn't be beaten if they were properly led.
Lee admitted after Gettysburg that he simply asked too much of his men there, and I believe that goes a long way in explaining why he continued the offensive on the second and third days there.
The troops are streaming back from Pickett's charge. It's one of the great moments in the war. Lee rode forth among them, trying to cheer them, trying to restore some sense of morale, and admitting to them it was all my fault.
No blame can be attached to the Army for its failure to accomplish what was projected by me. I am alone to blame. Robert E. Lee, July 31st, 1863.
Gettysburg was, I think, Lee's greatest disappointment militarily during the war. Lee was not given to wearing his heart on his sleeve or to bemoaning his fate, but I think that the fact that he would offer to tender his resignation in the wake of the Gettysburg campaign may be an indication that he saw the handwriting on the wall.
Mr. President, no one is more aware than myself of my inability for the duties of my position. I cannot even accomplish what I myself desire. How can I fulfill the expectation of others? In addition, I sensibly feel the growing failure of my bodily strength. Robert E. Lee, August 8, 1863.
What one has to remember, too, about Robert E. Lee in the Civil War is that this war broke him physically. It shortened his life appreciably. There is a good hypothesis that just before the Battle of Gettysburg, he actually had a heart attack.
After the loss at Gettysburg, Lee retreated across the Potomac, never to invade the North again. The following spring, a new Yankee general came to the field to fight Lee.
When General U.S. Grant takes command of all Union armies and travels with the Army of the Potomac, then it's now the first team going up against one another. It's Grant versus Lee.
Grant was not cowed by Lee, as he showed very quickly. I think he also underestimated Lee. I think that he did find out that Lee was different from the other opponents that he'd faced, just as Lee found out that Grant was different from the other opponents that he and the Army in Northern Virginia had faced.
Immediately upon taking command, Grant issued orders to George Meade and the Army of the Potomac.
Lee's army will be your objective point. Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also. Lieutenant General U.S. Grant, April 9th, 1864.
Grant relentlessly pursued Lee from the Wilderness to Spotsylvania, across the North Anna River, and then to Cold Harbor, where horrible carnage ruled the day. Throughout the bloody campaign, and in spite of heavy losses, Lee gallantly led his army.
On May the 6th, 1864, when the Confederate line was wavering, he rode to the front, set an example himself, and in effect demanded that his men stand their ground in those very difficult circumstances with thousands of Union soldiers bearing down on them. He did the same thing in the Muleshoe at Spotsylvania.
By the time of Cold Harbor, Lee had already seen enough of Grant to know that even a bloody setback was not going to stop the man. After June 1864, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had been pushed back into the defenses of Richmond and Petersburg. He's taken out of the war, effectively. He cannot maneuver. There's nowhere for him to go. All he can do is sit and react as Grant, around him, acts.
It must have been very tragic for Lee to find himself ultimately bottled up at Petersburg. Lee loved the open fight. Lee loved the war of maneuver. And once his army was pinned down, was besieged, I think he realized the end was in sight.
Lee's anguish in June was heightened by news that his home, Arlington, had been confiscated by the Union government.
It was seized for unpaid taxes in 1864, and in spring of that year, June, it was made into a large national soldier cemetery. The graves were at the behest of Montgomery Meigs, the Quartermaster General of the Union Army. Those graves were to be placed as close to the house as possible in order to preclude its use as a private dwelling after the war.
It's a cruel blow to Lee when Arlington becomes a cemetery and when he knows that his son will not inherit Arlington as he would have in the normal course of affairs.
Still, the cruelest blow was yet to come. Through the winter of 1864, Lee's army lacked forage, rations, and supplies, but somehow the men retained their fighting spirit. That, however, would disappear in April 1865. In April 1861, Robert E. Lee chose a path that 4 years later led him to the Virginia hamlet of Appomattox Courthouse. There, after a final desperate flight from Richmond, Lee surrendered his army and ended the Civil War.
The mass of Lee's army was whipped badly south of Petersburg, and to save the remnant, he was forced to evacuate Richmond. Lieutenant General U.S. Grant, April 3rd, 1865.
From present indications, the retreat of the enemy is rapidly becoming a rout. I see no escape for Lee. General Philip Sheridan, April 5th.
General Grant, Sheridan says if the thing is pressed, that Lee will surrender. Let the thing be pressed. Abraham Lincoln, April 7th.
That Friday in 1865, Union General U.S. Grant sent a message across the picket lines to General Robert E. Lee. With the Army of Northern Virginia starving and on the run, Grant knew it was time to begin his dialogue with Lee.
General, the result of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance in this struggle. I regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. Very respectfully, U.S. Grant, April 7th.
General Grant, though not entertaining the opinion you express on the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia, I reciprocate your desire to avoid useless effusion of blood, and therefore ask the terms you will offer and condition of its surrender. Very respectfully, Robert E. Lee, April 7th.
Peace being my great desire, there is but one condition I would insist upon, namely, that the men and officers surrendered shall be disqualified from taking up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged. I will meet you at any point agreeable to you. U.S. Grant, April 8th.
To be frank, I do not think the emergency has arisen to call for the surrender of the army. But as the restoration of peace should be the sole object of all, I should be pleased to meet you at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Robert E. Lee, midnight, April 8th.
As I have no authority to treat on the subject of peace, the meeting proposed for 10 a.m. today could lead to no good. The terms upon which peace can be had are well understood. U.S. Grant, 4 a.m., April 9th.
I now request an interview in accordance with the offer contained in your letter of yesterday. Robert E. Lee, April 9th.
That morning, Lee put on his best uniform and went to the home of Wilmer McLean, where he met General Grant.
When I went into the house, I found General Lee. In my rough traveling suit, the uniform of a private with the straps of a lieutenant general, I must have contrasted very strangely with a man so handsomely dressed, 6 feet high and of faultless form. Ulysses S. Grant.
Grant, the mud-spattered, unostentatious, silent little man. Lee, the tall, immaculately uniformed, spotless, dignified, Washington-like man. I think in a sense you have a meeting of the modern and the old-fashioned.
It became an event of hugely symbolic importance, where there is no demands for punishment inflicted by Grant. He allows these men to go home.
Those terms were far more generous than any rebel officer, which is what Lee was, had a right to expect. And I think it was a measure of Grant's respect for Lee that he handled himself and handled the terms the way he did.
It's characteristic of Lee that once he found out what Grant was going to give him, he found a diplomatic way of asking for more. He had read his man. He could see by the tone of their conversation and by the terms as originally outlined that Grant felt no spirit of vindictiveness.
Grant's terms were honorable. Officers could keep their sidearms, baggage, and mounts. The enlisted men would be paroled after furling colors and stacking arms.
Lee signed not so much terms of surrender as he did the birth certificate of a nation, the United States. And the country was born in that moment. Lee walked out of the parlor onto the front porch of the McLean house, and he stopped, and he inexplicably looked off in the distance and beat one hand into the open palm of the other and said nothing. And history has always wondered what was going through his mind.
He was cheered by the Confederates, and he was saluted by the Union Army. Of course, the first member of the Union Army to take off his hat and salute to Lee was Ulysses S. Grant. Once Appomattox was over, he had one duty, and it was to reunite the country.
After the war, Lee became president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, and dedicated his last years to education. On September 28, 1870, Lee went to a school meeting. On the way home, he caught a cold. 14 days later, the general died at his post.
I have never so truly felt the purity of his character as now, when I have nothing left me but its memory. A memory which I know will be cherished in many hearts besides mine. Mary Custis Lee, October 12, 1870.
There was a huge funeral service in Lexington. The service was attended by thousands of Americans, not Southerners, but Americans. And Lee was buried in the chapel.
I did only what my duty demanded. I could have taken no other course without dishonor. And if it all were to be done over again, I should act in precisely the same manner. Robert E. Lee.
In life, Robert E. Lee used words like gentleman, honor, and duty. In legend, he defines them so completely that in Virginia they still tell the story of a little boy who came home from Sunday school and said, "Mama, I'm confused. Was General Lee in the Old Testament or the New?"
information, read R.E. Lee by Douglas Southall Freeman and The Wartime Papers of Robert E. Lee, edited by Clifford Dowdy. For more information on the APCWS, write to P.O. Box 1862, Fredericksburg.
Robert E. Lee, forever a part of Civil War Journal.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child.
Lee's army is really whipped. I feel that our success is already assured.
There's nothing left for me to do than go see General Grant. And I would rather die 1,000 deaths. Robert E. Lee, April 9th, 1865.
On the afternoon of April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee waited half an hour for Union General U.S. Grant in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house in Appomattox, Virginia. As commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's achievements were unequal in the war. But that afternoon, as he waited for Grant, Lee contemplated the hour of surrender.
He may have flashed back to scenes with the men of the Army in Northern Virginia who lay in the fields around Appomattox, hungry and tired, exhausted. He may have thought about their triumphs, or he may have replayed some of the moments where things might have gone differently and taken him to some other place than Appomattox in the spring of 1865.
A great many things were going through his mind, but fighting for the surface had to be the fact that all three of his sons had been reported missing.
Perhaps he looked back as well upon all that had transpired the 4 years before and asked himself how he wound up there.
I think above all, he must have felt a tremendous sadness. Lee was a man who felt the tragedy of war. He also wanted to spare useless bloodshed. He was a man who could have and would have taken advantage of any military option that came his way, but there were no more options.
What General Lee's feelings were, I do not know. As he was a man of much dignity, with an impassible face, it was impossible to say whether he felt inwardly glad that the end had finally come, or felt sad over the result and was too manly to show it. Ulysses S. Grant, 1885.
For Robert E. Lee, the road to Appomattox clearly began in Arlington, Virginia on the night of April 19, 1861, when he resigned from the United States Army. But that decision, like every decision in his storied life, was deeply rooted in the history of his family and his nation.
I know of no country that can produce a family all distinguished as clever men as our Lees. George Washington, 1777.
He was born into Virginia aristocracy, a combination of two of Virginia's most venerated families, the Lees and the Carters. Two of his uncles had signed the Declaration of Independence. His father was one of George Washington's most dependable compatriots.
His father was Light Horse Harry Lee, a hero of the American Revolution. His mother was Anne Hill Carter, from a long line of people who had felt responsible for serving their communities.
Both of his parents, for very different reasons, were strong influences on his later development. His father was audacious.
If a single word describes the model Christian soldier, it is duty. In the Civil War, duty came to bear heavily upon many soldiers fighting for the North and the South. But throughout the long, terrible conflict, no single man was called to greater duty nor suffered more the tug of all human struggles than Robert E. Lee.
South Carolina secedes.
Mississippi,
Florida,
Alabama,
Georgia, Louisiana,
Texas secedes.
Arlington was never more beautiful than it was that spring when my husband was summoned to Washington.
Virginia secedes.
Lee, you have made the greatest mistake of your life. Winfield Scott.
If I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home. George McClellan.
If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it.
Let us pass over the river and rest under the shade of the trees.
Yesterday, we rode on the pinnacle of success. Today, absolute ruin seems to be our portion.
On the battlefield, willing to take risks, which Lee certainly was as a soldier, but his father also defined things that Lee knew he didn't want to be. His father had not been able to exercise self-control and take care of his family. He'd abandoned his family. And that, I think, was a stark lesson for young Robert E. Lee.
It was his mother who raised him to love God, to serve his country. And the word duty became a preeminent guidepost for Lee all of his life. And this was really due to the training of Ian Hill Carter and the Carter clan.
Robert Edward Lee was born in the cold winter of 1807 on January 19th at Stratford Hall, his family's ancestral home along the Potomac River. Here he grew through infancy. In 1810, financial ruin sent his luckless father to debtor's prison, and the family was forced to leave Stratford. When it came time to go, young Bobby Lee, all of 3 years old, showed his first true measure of devotion.
When they got the carriage ready to roll up in the fall of 1810, he ran back to the nursery. This wonderful iron fireback in the back of the room of the nursery has two little angels at the top. And they say that he kissed the angels on the fireback goodbye. The angels are still there. Whether the story is accurate or not, we really don't.